Today I'm joined by Shelley Eden, Director of law firm Gaze Burt and a long-time employment law expert, to talk about some key employment issues of late. And Shelley, let's start with the good news first, our new public holiday on Monday.
Yes, I mean, good news and maybe not so good news for some people. I think it's a lovely commemoration for the country, and it is specifically to honour Queen Elizabeth's passing and her years of dedicated service, to the Crown and to the Commonwealth, and therefore to New Zealand. I think it's difficult for some employers at quite short notice to arrange rosters and work out costs and so forth around a new public holiday. But I mean, I for one am looking forward to heading to the beach if the weather's fine.
So what has to be remembered by employers about this day? What is the key thing from their perspective?
The key thing is it's a regular public holiday.
Right.
It's a one-off. So when you look at the legislation, it's specific to this year, 2022. But other than that, it's like every other public holiday. So probably three key things. Firstly, most of your workers are entitled to a paid day off at their relevant daily pay. If you are open on the public holiday and shop hours are normal, there's no change to trading hours, so you can still trade on Monday. So if you require people to work, they have to be paid at a time and a half of their regular rate. And then if that would also usually be their working day, so it's a Monday, like for me and you, we normally work Mondays, then also they're entitled to an alternative day off if you make them work. So hopefully that makes sense. It's kind of three key things, but it's business as usual for holidays. Most employers understand their public holiday obligations pretty well.
Right, but it is kind of foisted upon them, isn't it? I mean, they have had a few other public holidays to consider recently.
Yes, well, the lovely public holiday of Matariki, which I think we've all... a lot of New Zealanders have really wanted and really enjoyed, and the timing of that was brilliant. But I think the reality is for employers, it really hits the bottom line. You can calculate the cost of this day off either in reduction in productivity, reduction in work being completed, or added costs to employers on their payroll, which is something that, after a couple of really rough years, I'm sure a lot of employers will be seeing it as a good and bad thing.
Yeah, I totally agree. Let's talk about final government vaccine mandates, which are set to disappear next Monday. I thought these had already gone, but they're still around.
You are not the only one. Look, so that's all... It's the last residual mandates for health and disability workers. So what happened is last year when the mandates got put in place under what we sort of call the Vaccinations order, or the order we often describe it as, they were put in progressively. So we started off with things like MIQ workers and customs border workers, and then it became other groups, education, health and disability, and so forth. And then they've slowly been being peeled back. And with the last one due to go on Monday for health and disability workers.
That's interesting. So you can actually go to hospital now and people don't have to be vaccinated to look after you.
Come Tuesday, that's right. And it's quite interesting because the vaccinations that people were required were initially the first 2 doses. And then for most groups, I think it was also the booster was added. But of course, since, some people got their first vaccination last August, they may have already had their second booster, but it may have been some time ago, or their first booster. So actually probably quite a lot of people out there aren't technically vaccinated by what we might tend to think of that language usually. And also given that the vaccines wane, and we know that their efficacy wanes. And so I'd say that quite a lot of your people technically aren't vaccinated now, but as from Tuesday, a hire could be made of someone who is unvaccinated into the health sector.
That's very interesting. So people who lost their job over that time because they weren't vaccinated, can they reapply, or do they have an automatic right of coming back into their jobs?
No automatic right. They were fired. They would have been had their employment terminated. There was a process under a new schedule. It's called Schedule 3A to the Employment Relations Act, which set out that process for giving the 4 weeks notice. You'll probably remember that. Most people's terminations happened either last year or in the first few months of this year. So no right to reapply. I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the health sector. We know they're crying out for employees,
Yes.
Health and disability, especially in the aged care sector. And so you would imagine that they will want those people to come knocking on their door, most likely. I think there is a question mark over whether those people will want to come back. We've had some clients who had their employment terminated through the mandates, and most of them don't want to return to their previous employer.
Yeah, it's a very divisive issue, isn't it?
Yes, it remains so.
Yeah.
And so I think, in the sense that this is like the final sort of tidy up, like it is something to celebrate. the mandates ending finally, in the sense that it shows that we've come through a process with COVID-19, and at least from the government's perspective, we're more or less out the other side. I think there is a wider piece there for the people whose employment was terminated. I'm not sure that they will be celebrating, but then for employers in the industry who can now don't have to worry about that side of things, don't have to do that compliance with their workers, the checks that they've been vaccinated, and then can take all comers, I think for them it will probably be a relief as well.
Did the court see many cases of people aggrieved over the mandates or confused or anything like that?
Steady stream of cases, yes, steady stream coming through and coming out all of the time, the decisions coming out with varying results. A lot of the time the mandates were upheld, but it's all about how the employer acted, what they did. Did they act reasonably? Did they follow that Schedule 3A that I mentioned? We've got a client who's raising a grievance this week for various reasons. She's not needed to do it until now. And so they're still unfolding. If she were to go to court, we might not have a hearing till next year. So there's a little bit of water to go under the bridge in the terms of the case law.
Do you think, given the case law, albeit it hasn't gone under the bridge yet, would the government do anything differently, do you think, if they were going to introduce a mandate back into the... Because, I mean, COVID isn't over and it is flaring up in other parts of the world. It could come back?
It's a really good question. I think sort of tension areas have been around the definitions of the types of workers and who were and weren't affected by the mandate. So I could imagine that if I was writing that legislation, I'd just be absolutely carefully precise. It's quite simple legislation, so in some ways you almost don't need to change it too much. It did what it did. But probably, I think the thing that employers needed at the time was certainty and understanding of what their obligations were. And respectfully to the government, I'm not sure that was always present. And I think there is a little bit of that now, where with the final mandate going and the official statement being now it's up to employers to determine what they do in relation to mandates. And that I just think is a bit like, well, yeah, but so what? Does that mean we can or can't?
Yes. Does that mean? So if an employer says, I want everyone here to be vaccinated, an employee could actually say, well, I don't need to be.
I think we're pretty close to that. So technically, in theory, you could still have a mandate in your place of business. You would need a health and safety justification for that. You would need to understand that what vaccination meant. Was someone who'd had COVID and perhaps had some immunity that way, would they be okay or would they not be okay? So there's some tricky questions. The WorkSafe position on at this stage is essentially if working in the business gives the person greater risk of catching COVID-19, transmitting COVID-19 through their work, higher than the risk during their regular life, then you might be able to mandate. But for most people now, in most of our jobs, our risk of catching and transmitting COVID-19 is probably not higher at work. And so I actually think it's going to be very difficult to justify. Very, very rare jobs maybe, and I don't rule it out, but it would need to be very carefully thought out by employers before putting in a new mandate on the back of or putting in their own mandate on the back of the government ones receding.
And we haven't seen any indication that hospitals and so forth and aged care will be doing that?
I have heard that there may be some hospitals still doing that.
Yes.
But whether that's true or not, I don't know. It's a bit of a rumour. You sort of hear these things. But it's possible. Yeah, I think it's difficult to justify, honestly. But they would just have to do their their health and safety risk assessment, and they'd have to then apply it to the roles where they felt it could be applied to, and then work it through with the individuals. And it may be that when they do that, and they do that taking into account the risk of not vaccinating, and even perhaps the risk of vaccinating. We've just seen our first, confirmed death due to the vaccination in New Zealand this week. And so when you weigh everything into account, they may well reach that point where they say, no, we believe we can justify requiring vaccinations. Or it may be that they reach the point of saying, we think this can be managed in other ways through testing and continued mask wearing and that type of thing.
Wow, so it is going to be an issue perhaps ongoing for a little while yet.
For some employers, I think most employers have just gone, thank goodness I don't have to worry about all that anymore, and moved on, which I think is probably, helpful for employers not to have to turn their minds to this anymore. But it's not quite a dead issue yet.
Shelley, thank you so much for coming in and talking to MBR.
It's a pleasure. It's nice to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.